I love the conversation this morning. I look forward to conversation with you all this evening about a topic that I think really matters and that this church is really well poised to be an important player, I think, in your local community, regional, and national communities. As Jane said, I've been doing a lot of thinking about polarization and how as Christians we faithfully navigate this deeply polarized time in our national history. Today I want to think about that, especially in terms of kind of church life. Tomorrow morning I want to think about it more in terms of the present and just our national life, as how do we engage as citizens. Tonight, thinking a little bit, again, historically, using history to kind of get at questions about what's possible. I say the perils and the promise of a big tent. Part of what we talked about this morning about Christian nationalism, and we talked about how one thing that we can all do in a time of surging Christian nationalism, one thing a congregation like this one can do, is cast a vision of a different kind of way to live out our faith. And it's clear to me that you all are doing that work. So I think one of the ways that you can cast, potentially, this is what I want to talk to you about, and I hope we can have a good conversation about it in the Q&A. One way to cast a different vision in these hyper-polarized times is to build bigger tents. It's to love those who are, in our view, wrong, even deeply wrong. And tonight I want to say and use a kind of case study from history to say that the tradition in which this church sits offers us resources for how to do this. So I want to think a little bit about a particular example of this. I also know Peter shared with me in advance of me coming out here a chapter about this church's life in the 1960s. Another time of great national strife, turmoil, division, and the ways, I don't know if you've all read this chapter. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Peter? Rocking the Ark. It's a really fascinating story about this congregation, which in the 60s really did represent a wide array of perspectives in the way that two different pastors were trying to hold the church together and at the same time cast a faithful witness in a society that was trying to figure out the shape of justice. It's obviously the era of civil rights, the era of the Vietnam War, and all of these difficult questions that the society was struggling to deal with. The chapter is all about how this church dealt with it, and I really appreciated the chance to read and learn from it. He also shared the policy on social witness that you all have, the kind of how you come to a decision about when to advocate for something. I was really impressed. I think it's a really thoughtful way to approach these questions. How do you bring an issue to your leadership, to your congregation, and discern whether this is something that you're ready to sort of lead out on in circles of the church, circles of society. This is all, I think, really remarkable stuff, and all the more important to be able to draw on your own experience as a congregation as we move through these times. I want to read something from 30 years ago. Princeton sociologist Robert Wuthnow, who is one of the people I interviewed actually last year for the series that I did, 30 years ago published a book called The Restructuring of American Religion. Fascinating book, important book, in which he talked about something that was happening already at that point. We had been a nation where people were really attached to their denominational identity. You were Presbyterian, or you were Methodist, or you were Baptist, and you were willing to partner or whatnot. But that denominational identity was really important. And what Wuthnow charted more than 30 years ago was that denominational loyalties were becoming less important. And what was becoming more important were kind of ideological perspectives. So the new dividing line in American Christianity and American Protestantism in particular wasn't between Presbyterians and Methodists. It was between conservatives and liberals. So this is what he had to say. Both ends of the theological spectrum thought their opponents had too much influence, especially over religious agencies, the government, and the schools. It's not surprising that people should think this way, given the public statements their leaders have made. Tall steeples, no people, was the phrase one pastor of a large conservative church used to characterize his liberal counterparts. They've kept only the bathwater and thrown out everything else, declared a liberal critic in an impassioned sermon about fundamentalists. Recounting the, quote, inflexibility, intolerance, and passion for annihilation among evangelicals, another liberal pastor said it made him think of, quote, the Great Inquisition and the Dark Ages. Shilly-shallying, a conservative pastor told an interviewer, we want no association with churches that can't get serious about preaching the Christian faith. Those quotes are from 1988. So it's safe to say these bad feelings have, in many cases, only gotten worse. We find ourselves in a moment where big tents are collapsing. What do I mean by big tents? I mean congregations that had once been home to folks with different perspectives are struggling to live that out. Denominations that had once been home to varieties of different kinds of perspectives are shrinking. Christian colleges and universities and seminaries are struggling with, can we be places that bring Christians together across the lines that divide? We struggle with this, honestly, at Princeton Seminary. We can talk all about it in the Q&A. I know this church and that chapter about the 1960s makes clear that this church was a big tent in the 1960s and one that wasn't always working especially well, but where people were trying to find their way forward through the issues of the day in a faithful manner. For many of us, and we talked about this a little bit this morning, it's hard enough in our personal lives to find ways to relate to people who disagree with us, people who see the world differently than we do. What about our institutions? What about our home congregations? What about our denominations? I think there's all different kinds of thorny questions here about where we should be working to build bigger tents. Where is it appropriate to have a big tent? Sometimes we may need spaces that are actually smaller tents. Sometimes we need places of refuge, places of strengthening, places where we can be encouraged and not always be fighting the battles of the day. You know, we need places where we can be recharged. But the thing I worry about right now is not that we won't have those spaces, but that may be all that we have. That we're increasingly retreating, and spaces that had once been places where people came together across difference aren't able to sustain that kind of interaction anymore. And what are the impacts for our church and for our society? Protestants have always kind of struggled with this. Catholics, you may know, the World Catholic Church is home to unbelievable diversity of opinion. People, I have Catholic friends who say, you can believe anything and be Catholic. You just have to fight for that belief in the Catholic Church, and you try to, you represent that view. We Protestants don't really do that very well. We tend to want to split off when we have deep disagreements and kind of go our own ways, have our own institutions. And in the context of today, part of what I think on the right and on the left in American Christian worlds, Protestant worlds in particular, people look across the aisle and they say, that's not my circus. Those aren't my people. I don't even know what they're talking about over there. Certainly, probably folks in this room can feel that way about the folks I was talking about this morning. And they feel that way about folks, in congregations like this one. And so, sometimes in the way that we've told the story of American Protestantism in my field, it can feel like it's always been this way. We've always been deeply divided. We've never been able to come together across lines of difference. If you, in my field, we used to tell this story about the kind of great divorce within American Protestantism. Here are images of, Darwinism and industrial strife in the late 19th century. There's a period when American Protestants were struggling to incorporate new ways of reading the Bible and starting to really argue about how we should read the Bible, whether it was the old ways or these kind of newer ways that were coming from Germany. You got Billy Sunday, who was this kind of old-style revival preacher, really pugnacious, highly, he was a fighter. And Billy Sunday, he loved to fight, and he really loved to fight liberal Christians. He loved to fight anyone who wasn't sort of in his camp. This story about kind of the great Protestant divorce between kind of liberal Protestants and conservative Protestants almost always heads toward Dayton, Tennessee, where in the 1920s, if you've seen Inherit the Wind, It's kind of classic film in the 1920s. And it's a classic American showdown between William Jennings Bryan, who was a fundamentalist, a Democratic candidate for president many times, failed to win the presidency. Fascinating character in so many ways. We could talk about William Jennings Bryan all night, but we won't. He faced off against Clarence Darrow, this famous free thinker, over the question of whether evolution should be taught in the schools. And if you haven't seen Inherent the Wind, you should see it. It kind of dramatizes this remarkable clash. The story that we used to tell in my field was that after Dayton, after the Scopes monkey trial, as it was called, Darrow won. Bryan won the trial. He was arguing in defense of a Tennessee teacher who was accused of teaching evolution. He won the trial, but he lost the war. He was humiliated. Fundamentalists were humiliated, and they kind of ran in and retreated from the public square. Liberals had the public square for a little while, and then the religious right came out of the woodwork in the 1980s, per our conversation this morning. That's the story we told. It was a story about a great divorce. Conservatives and liberals, and never the two shall meet, especially after the Scopes monkey trial. I think there's another story, and it's a story I want to just tell you briefly tonight. It's a story about an organization that was, for most of the mid-20th century, through this tumultuous period where your church was trying to figure out how to hang together, it was an organization that came together, and it's called the Federal Council of Churches. Formed in 1908. Its successor, the National Council of Churches, is still around. It's a small organization these days. But in its heyday, the Federal Council of Churches, founded in 1908, was a huge, unwieldy tent that came together with two goals. One, to show the unity of Christ Church. And two, to reform society, to improve society. That was what we wanted to do. How big was the tent? The Federal Council of Churches at its founding in 1908 included 33 denominations. It included all the kind of big, what we would call at that point evangelical churches, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists. It included a bunch of small denominations, the Quakers, the Moravians, the Reformed Church in America. It included, notably, this is where I'm going, 4 of the nation's leading black denominations. African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and the National Baptist Convention. So part of what's fascinating to me about this organization, the thing that they required was a belief in Jesus Christ. That was what you had to believe in order to participate. It excluded some people. The Unitarians wanted in, they couldn't get in. But it mostly included, most Protestant denominations in the United States. And so what you had in the Federal Council is unbelievable unwieldiness. You had arch segregationists in the South, the ardent defenders of Jim Crow. You had Ida B. Wells, Adam Clayton Powell, Nancy Burroughs, Revity Ransom, and the most ardent black civil rights activists of the early 20th century. You had northern, moderate, white Christians. You had a huge array of folks all together in this big tent organization with two goals: showing the unity of Christ Church and improving society, helping to kind of work for the kingdom on earth. It's not easy. Not easy to hang together in this big of a tent. And part of what I want to do with you, and I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to kind of speed. But I think, where was the controversy in this organization? This organization was huge. It had its fingers on all kinds of things. It had a commission on rural life. It had a commission on evangelism. It had commissions on all kinds of different issues. The Federal Council was really interested in lots of stuff. And this was a period when Protestants really were really important players in American society. I mean, it really mattered what the Federal Council had to say on various issues. So where was the controversy? Controversy was always at the Commission on Social Concerns. And that was where all the action was at. That's where all the controversy was at. What are we going to say about the main justice questions of our day? And remember, you've got everybody under this tent. At its founding, you don't have to read this, but I just put it up here for kicks. At its founding in 1908, the Federal Council adopted a social creed where it took positions on a variety of hot-button issues. It said that the churches should stand for, quote, equal rights and complete justice for all men in all stations of life, for the abolition of child labor, for such regulation of the conditions of toil for women as will safeguard the physical and moral health of the community, for a living wage, the abatement of poverty, and more. And the council's earliest promotional materials reflected the fact that it really, part of the thing that brought these folks together was a sense that we can do things together that we can't do apart. There are things that this bigger tent was able to really advocate for that they would have struggled to advocate for as individual denominations. It was really hard. I'm going to speed through. You kind of right away, you hit controversy because when the council wants to say things about, say, the Great Depression and the New Deal, and by the 1930s, the federal council has really become a well-established organization by the time of the New Deal, and is trying to sort of fight for justice and stand up for the concerns of the millions of Americans who are struggling to make it through the Great Depression, and sure enough, got lots of criticisms. How red is the Federal Council of Churches? This kind of tactic, right, is not new in our times. This is an old tactic. When the Federal Council tried to stand up on a particular question, not surprisingly, it would run into all kinds of controversy. Nothing tested the council's big tent like civil rights. And that's what I want to talk to you about. I think it's a really interesting example. I think it sets up interesting conversation for how we should live in our time today. Throughout the council's earliest years, the early 20th century years, it criticized race prejudice, quote unquote, and lynching. But it long endorsed voluntary acts of goodwill over any kind of policy stands. It invested lots of energy into exchanges of delegations between black and white congregations on a designated race relations Sunday. That kind of thing was a kind of stand in that era, but it was not. It was palatable to the Big Ten, right? It was the kind of thing that could get through the Big Ten. But in 1946, notably, the strategy changed when the FCC became the first large, predominantly white organization in the country to condemn Jim Crow, issuing a statement in which it, quote, renounced the pattern of segregation as, quote, unnecessary and undesirable and a violation of the gospel of love and human brotherhood, and it moreover pledged to, quote, work for a non-segregated church and a non-segregated society. How'd you get there? This statement reflected decades of painstaking work by black folks inside the tent, a tent that was really quite inhospitable to their presence. Remember who's inside this tent with them. But folks like Benjamin Mays and George Haynes, along with select white allies inside the council, women like Thelma Stevens, worked diligently over the course of decades on building support for this kind of statement. And when the FCC issues this statement, I have to say, it was a bombshell. It was a huge deal for a Big Ten organization that included the Southern Presbyterians and the Southern Methodists and all of these huge, including northern white denominations that had not been super interested in taking a stand on these questions. One of the nation's leading black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, proclaimed, quote, Jim Crow and the church were divorced this week by the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America. And within months of the FCC's statement in 1946, a half dozen Protestant denominations, the YMCA, the YWCA, followed suit. Now, on the inside, the leadership of this organization is trying to manage all the criticism, right? And so they're getting all kinds of letters from their constituents and all kinds of pushback. And, they're not always in their responses. The documentary, you can go and read their letters at the Presbyterian Historical Society of Philadelphia. And the general secretary is trying to smooth it over. And he's trying to make it all work. And he's trying to keep people happy. But they passed the statement. Would they be able to kind of continue to mount that kind of prophetic witness? In 1948, another opportunity arose. 1948, a statement declaring that human rights, quote, cannot be obtained under a system of racial segregation once more provoked a lot of internal white opposition. The council was prepared to move forward over and against the vehement criticism of Southern Presbyterian delegates to pass this anti-Jim Crow resolution when, and this is important and notable, a Methodist bishop from Pennsylvania, so a white northern Christian, stood up and made a last-ditch parliamentary intervention, attempting to refer the statement to the executive committee where it could be tabled forever. Classic. The move prompted, and this is again key, because the size of the tent, right? Who's included? If anyone was not going to be included in the tent at this point, it was going to be these historic black congregations. Their inclusion was controversial. It was challenging for the FCC even to find places to meet, because the FCC insisted that it would not meet in cities where the hotels were segregated, because that was an offense to the members of these black congregations. When the parliamentary moves going forward, a black minister from Gary, Indiana, stood up and declared, "Most of you do not know the horror of having money in your pocket and being unable to buy food, or being sleepy and not being able to find a place to sleep." His words generated loud cheers and renewed resolve, and in 1948, that statement passed too. Similar heroics required again in 1952, when, again, white Southern delegates attempted to slow the adoption of a statement on the churches and segregation by the FCC's successor organization, the National Council of Churches. The members of Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of the nation's historic black congregations, were absolutely disgusted by these tactics and voted to secede from the federal council. So sometimes you have to leave a big tent. I want to come back to that. With their pastor, Adam Clayton Powell, remarking, "How can we expect the legislators of America to be more Christ-like than their clergymen?" That same day, 75 AME pastors met in New York City and passed a resolution demanding that the National Council move the statement forward. That pressure produced the needed breakthrough, and a strong version of the statement passed in 1952. These methods didn't always work. Sometimes the bewildering variety, the unwieldiness of the constituencies within the tent, along with the propensity of the overwhelmingly white male leadership inside this tent, they overwhelmingly tended to want to prioritize the concerns of white male constituents, yielded a deeply sinful failure to witness against the most heinous evil that was possible too inside the big tent. These are the Perils. Case in point. When in 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was tortured and murdered by white vigilantes, the NCC failed to muster even just a statement. One was composed by the black leader of the Department of Racial and Cultural Relations, but in the face of white consternation about criticizing the verdict of a jury, it was allowed to die in committee. Perils of a big tent, indeed. There was promise too. This organization, the FCC and then its successor, the NCC, did more than just issue statements. They didn't always wait for every member denomination to get on board before they commenced with doing the Lord's work on the ground. In fact, both the FCC and the NCC leaned into the idea that their responsibility was not only to speak for the churches, but sometimes to speak prophetically to the churches. This happened regularly throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, with the National Council of Churches investing resources into supporting communities as they began to desegregate the public schools, providing legal assistance and bail money to freedom fighters across the South, and importantly, mobilizing to lobby at the grassroots and in Washington in support of major civil rights legislation. It did all this work as a junior partner of the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, and other black-led civil rights organizations. But in no small part, because of the size of the tent, the shape of the tent, when the National Council and its member denominations threw their weight around, politicians listened. In the years immediately following King's letter from Birmingham jail, the church's efforts in the most unlikely of places, Indiana, Iowa, etc., helped to expand the coalition of United States senators willing to vote yes on the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This big tent movement, managing at times to hold faith and justice together, accomplished some remarkable things. But sustaining it was tough. This is where we can also talk. After, as the civil rights movement is cresting, these organizations are struggling. They're struggling because of the dynamics involved in sustaining these kinds of wide connections. Even as they're taking prophetic stands, they're struggling on the one hand to bring a lot of white lay people along. There's a widening gap in many of these denominations between progressive clergy and conservative lay people. On the other hand, if the churches and the National Council were too progressive for some kind of ordinary lay people, they were too plodding for many radicals. Young people who were sick and tired of waiting for, doing all the work to get this latest statement to pass, and who wanted the churches to act now. The churches, the National Council, were often caught between a kind of, in the middle of a country that was coming apart at the seams. And honestly, as the civil rights sort of movement is cresting, this coalition is buckling. And partly what we're living in now is a generation later, where that tent never entirely collapsed. Like I said, the National Council is still around to this day and still doing good work. There are other ecumenical organizations that are doing good work. But part of the story of what's happened to our tradition, the Presbyterian Church in the generation after the story I just told you, is splintering, and a lot of splintering. And I gather even in this area, right? There's been, churches have gone different ways. So that's part of the story. Again, our churches have lost members at times to the kinds of folks that we were talking about this morning. There's been a lot of energy in Christian nationalist circles for reasons that we sort of began to talk about this morning. There's a lot more to say about that. Our churches have struggled to bring in a new generation that isn't sure that the churches are standing up in the ways that they hope, for the kinds of concerns that they hope the churches would speak out on. And we know, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, that we're living through a period of not quite unprecedented, but really quite significant disaffiliation, especially in younger generations from Christian churches. So part of what has happened is the tent that was so important and so unwieldy and such a challenge, but that really did accomplish some remarkable things, has buckled and shrunk. And here we find ourselves, and I've had many conversations with some of you one-on-one about, are there other congregations like this one? What's coming? As the thing that we used to have is going away, what's next? We know Christian nationalism is surging. What are the possibilities for the kind of progressive witness that a church like this one has been able to mount, that the Federal Council and the National Council at its best were prophetic to mount? I want to sort of bring my part, the opening kind of part here, to a close by thinking about, I really do think that a church like this one has a vital role to play in an era of surging Christian nationalism. And so how do you play that role if you, A, aren't prophetic in the way that the world needs, if you aren't speaking truthfully about the need for justice in the world? And how do you play that role without, I think there's a temptation to say, as we pursue justice, we're going to cut off relationship to folks who aren't already in our choir. Can you be in coalition? This is the question. Can you be in coalition with folks who aren't with you on all the things? Maybe internally that's a question, right? Can you be in coalition with one another on questions? And that policy you have about advocacy helps you to kind of find your way forward. But what about beyond this church? As you think about partnering with other Christians, other folks in your area and around the country, part of what my push on this, and part of the attraction of big tents, part of what's interesting to me about them, and part of why I'm curious what you think, but I'd love for you to consider finding ways to hang together when you can in the midst of deep difference, is I think if we want the witness of churches like this one to grow, that's part of what's needed. We have to stay in touch with people who don't already see the world, who don't already practice their faith like we do. Because that's how our witness can grow. It's hard to do that. It's hard to stay in coalition. It's hard to stay in conversation, both as individuals, as institutions. But I think there's something there that if we want the witness of congregations like this one to grow in a time of surging Christian nationalism, that may be part of what we have to figure out how to do. So that's my tee up. I'm eager to think with you about all this stuff. This is very thorny. It's tricky. Again, I think that there are probably ways in which, some spaces don't need to be big tents. Other spaces may need to be big tents. Other spaces, where do we need to push the boundaries out? Where do we need to find comfort and refuge? Those are the kinds of things that I think are tricky and require a lot of discernment and wisdom. The leaders of a church like this one have that wisdom and discernment to figure that out. My push is to think about how do you keep building bigger tents in a society where they're collapsing every day. Eager to think with you about that.